Hello everyone. In this lecture, we're going to talk about a very important subject, punctuation. However, before you run away, let me assure you this is probably going to go much quicker and easier than you originally thought. Again, a very important subject, and you know it, you've heard about it. Let's learn how to do it right, and let's do it as simply and painlessly as possible. Let's begin. First, we're going to begin with Brian's first through third laws of punctuation. Here we come, the first three laws of punctuation according to Brian. And once again, these are all of my fundamental laws. This is the way that I understand English and punctuation. And all I did was at the end review a few Google searches to verify that I didn't miss anything major. And otherwise, you're seeing my understanding of punctuation. Law number one, use a period to terminate a sentence. So in the last lecture, we learned about words and how the first word in a sentence is going to be capitalized, how we'll end with a period, and we can have either one or more spaces, or one or two spaces, I should say, before the next sentence, no spaces at the end of a paragraph. Instead, we have a new line and then maybe five, and that's how I'm getting through the last lecture. But the point is that you end sentences with a period, and a sentence expresses a complete thought. Let's look at law number two. Use commas to insert pauses in sentences. Now, we're going to do quite a bit of work just in this lecture on commas and recognizing these pauses. So I'm going to move on right now from the second law to the third law. This is really more an amendment of the first law, saying instead of using a period, use a question mark to terminate a sentence that asks a question. Okay? I paraphrased that for some reason, but you can now use either periods or question marks to terminate sentences, depending on if the sentence asks a question or not. Now, I wanted to add some additional information on commas. Here's the beginning of all the information you're going to get on commas. This is my humble opinion. It's better to use too few commas than too many. I've seen comma-itis. You can put in commas to the point that it actually changes the meaning of a sentence, makes it incorrect. Don't get carried away with commas. Keep it simple. And it's best to read your work out loud to hear the pauses, which are the commas, in your writing. Now notice how there was a little pause in what is a parenthetical expression or an aside. This is one example of where you want to use commas. And notice how there was a pause. Work out loud to hear pauses, which are the commas, in your writing. This little aside is set aside by commas, delimiting the start and the end of the aside. Once again, it's called a parenthetical expression or an aside, and we're going to look more at that when we look into commas. But for right now, I want to move on to the laws of punctuation for fiction. Here I'm going to add Brian's fourth law, and it's the law of punctuating fiction, and here it is. Use double quotes to enclose dialogue. Now, when you use double quotes, your program, whatever you're using, may translate them, like Word does, into these smart quotes. Notice the kind of yin-yang looking symbol to the quotes in the parentheses? Well, what it'll do is it'll put the one set of quotes at the front and the other set of quotes at the end, as in this example. Hi, Carol. Notice the comma used to separate the sentence and who is being spoken to, and then a period at the end. And all of this occurs within the double quotes. And notice they're smart quotes. So one kind of points down and the other points up. That's part of PowerPoint and how it uses double quotes. Note, I'll be discussing dialogue in greater detail in a later lecture. So let's move on. And that's it. I know, I surprised you, didn't I? You weren't quite expecting this yet, but that's the basics of punctuation. Now, I know it went by so fast that you probably forgot what we even said, so let's review. Use a single period to terminate a sentence. Use commas to insert pauses into sentences, and remember, it's best to read your stuff to hear those pauses where the commas belong. Use a single quotation mark instead of a period to terminate a sentence that asks a question. And use double quotes to enclose dialogue. That's it. That is all 4 of my laws of punctuation, and with that, you can do a lot. And in fact, I want to bring you now to Brian's guiding principle of punctuation. And can you guess what it is? That's right, keep it simple. And in fact, as a supporting argument, I'm going to state this. I can write compelling and persuasive prose using no punctuation other than a period and a comma. If I had to ask a question and I didn't have a question mark, I'd just rephrase it to not be a question. I can get along with periods and commas. Now, of course, you'll have to cede me the double quote for dialogue if you want me to write fiction. There's a lot of dialogue in fiction, and I need the double quotes then. And, okay, I'll admit that a question mark is quite handy when it comes to asking questions. So that's it. I call it 4-mark punctuation, or the basics of punctuation. You just use a period, a comma, a question mark, and quotes for dialogue. That's it. Now, are you ready to expand on the basics? We've learned the basics, and if that's all you want to know, go write using those. But we're going to extend this just a little further, and don't worry, there's not much further actually to go with punctuation. First, let's take the first and third laws and amend it slightly to expand it to call them sentence terminators and make a broader definition here. Sentences may be terminated by one of 3 punctuation marks: a period, a question mark, or an exclamation mark. We've added an exclamation mark to the list. Notable exceptions to this rule include the use of a colon to terminate a paragraph before a list, as in this very example. And here we have a list that follows. And notice the colon is at the end of that sentence to precede the list. You should try to avoid needless spaces after the last sentences in a paragraph. This is just for producing clean text that's easy to publish. These extra spaces show up on Kindles and stuff like that as new pages in some cases. And note, the items in a bulleted list and titles are not terminated using punctuation. Notice that all of these slides don't have periods at the end. Well, they do in a list and the colon ending, but the rest of the bulleted items don't have punctuation ending them. And neither do the titles up at the top. And neither will the titles like Chapter 1 will not end with a period when you use that as the title to a chapter. Okay? So, there we've amended rules 1 and 3, and I want to talk a little bit about when I use exclamation marks, and that's for dialogue. First, you use exclamation marks to express extreme emotion. Now, I don't usually put that much emotion into my writing, so I usually relegate exclamation marks, as I quite often do question marks actually, to dialogue. So, "Don't you care?" she exclaimed. Notice how "don't you care" it makes that more of a dire statement. And you express that with the exclamation mark. And notice that the entire sentence with the exclamation mark is enclosed in quotes because it's what somebody is saying. So it's dialogue. Now, I want to go back and review, too. I want to look at the use of commas. Let me show you 4 specific cases in which you use commas to insert pauses in a sentence, and I want you to hear them as I read these sentences. First, as sentence lead-ins. Listen to these sentences. First, there was the weather. To be fair, it wasn't that bad. In fact, it was pretty good. Notice how there's that little pause where the comma occurs. All of these are kind of preconditions that give you a little warning about the sentence. Like first says this is going to be the first item. Like I'm going to create a list, basically. If I say first, there's probably going to be a second and a third. To be fair, here I'm warning that, this is maybe a clarification on the first sentence to be fair. And then in fact, I conclude, it was pretty good. So all of these are pre-qualifiers to the sentence or lead-ins. Next, we have lists. So, for instance, he won the first, second, and final race of the day. Now, I want to talk about one special comma, and that's a comma that I excluded from after the word second. If you're using Strunk and White or some standard tome such as that, it's a short tome, to define your punctuation, then you might include a comma there. It's called the Oxford comma, and there's great debate over whether there should be a comma between the, in this case, second element and the word and before the final element of this list, right? We have first, second, and final. So we have 3 items. Notice we have a comma between first and second, but we have the word without a comma between second and final. Now, if you use the Oxford comma, then you would put a comma after the word second and before and. I'm trying more and more to lose it because it's falling out of fashion. So I'm trying to follow that style. Anyway, just to give you a little old history on commas. Next comes parenthetical expressions. We've addressed those a little bit. Let me show you a really good one here. Sir Anthony, a notorious womanizer, was the last to arrive at the party. Now notice these parenthetical expressions, or these little asides. The way that I hear them in my head is that it's kind of like, oh, I'm going to whisper this little aside to add a little more information, but don't let anybody else hear, right? Like I'm whispering it to you. Sir Anthony, a notorious womanizer, was the last to arrive at the party, okay? So these little asides are parenthetical expressions. You could use parentheses to enclose them. I think that looks silly in fiction writing, so I use commas instead. And finally, for dialogue, we already covered quite a bit of this, and we're going to cover a little bit more dialogue before the end. You must be mistaken, comma, Audrey exclaimed. So when you put who's speaking, you end the sentence with a comma inside the double quotes. And then you move on with who said this thing. So that's the second law, using commas. And here's 4 great examples of where you use commas. I'm sure that there's others I missed, but these are the big opportunities I use. Now, what about comma alternatives? I know you're asking. For instance, when do I use parentheses? Well, it's with acronyms. First, you use parentheses much more in nonfiction than I do in fiction, and I can even use them for parenthetical asides rather than using commas, as I did in the last example. More of a nonfiction thing than I do in fiction. In fiction, I prefer to use commas to delimit parenthetical asides. As I showed you, the new student, who was a bit of a loner, left the room without comment. Notice how you get that lowering of voice, and I want to whisper this to you. That's what a parenthetical aside sounds like, and that's why I'm saying read your sentences out loud so you can hear these things and hear where the commas go. Now, I always use parentheses to identify acronyms. For instance, International Business Machines, IBM in parentheses, and the Internal Revenue Service, IRS in parentheses. Now, the rule is that once you define an acronym in this way, you can use the acronym instead of the full name. So I say International Business Machines and then IBM in parentheses once, and from then on, the rest of the book or whatever I'm writing, I can just keep saying IBM, and people will remember, supposedly, that it refers to International Business Machines. Now, if you use a lot of acronyms, and it's a long book, you might want to have a list of acronyms somewhere in there to remind people of the acronyms you're using. But anyway, this is the basic rule. And this is really the only place I use parentheses. When do I use semicolons? To combine sentences. Now, semicolons are used to insert a pause in a sentence harder and longer than a comma pause, but short of terminating the sentences in the case of a period. So a semicolon is somewhere between a colon and a period. Maybe that's why it includes both of them, a colon and a period. That's what it looks like. I don't need them. I have no need for something stronger than a comma and weaker than a period. I therefore only use them for one simple trick, and that's to connect sentences in this way. Consider these 2 sentences. Fairness in testing was not a priority. The tests were rigged. Now notice how the 2 sentences are kind of related. It would almost be nice to have them be one sentence, as in this example. Fairness in testing was not a priority, semicolon, specifically, comma, the tests were rigged. It allows me to put that little connector word in there, specifically, to talk about how the second sentence connects to the first, and then stuff them together with the semicolon. Isn't that a neat trick? So to make longer, more complicated sentences, if you want to write that way, if that's your style, or if it's the style for a particular thing you're writing, like somebody's dialogue style, then you might want to take advantage of this. Let's look at another example so we can get the hang of this. You may have grasped my point. Punctuation is simple. Now notice that hard pause there of the period. Instead, we could say, you may have grasped my point, namely that punctuation is simple. We use namely as a little connector word there in the semicolon and comma trick before and after it. So this is the only place I use semicolons to do this little connector trick with a word. Practice it. It's helpful. Next, I want to cover when my wife uses em dashes for parenthetical expressions. Now, I personally don't do this, but my wife has an interesting habit of using em dashes in place of commas in parenthetical expressions. So, Sonia was a mess. In fact, she was dressed in rags, though she was still technically considered royalty. She would do little asides like this using the em dash, which is just a long dash. It's an M-sized dash. M is the side of a space that's longer than an N, so it's not an N dash, it's an M dash, a longer dash. And this has become central to my wife's writing. It's pretty much defining part of her style. And this is your own style that you're going to be after. You're going to have your own style of punctuation. Interesting. Now, I want to look once again at the fourth law, using double quotes to enclose dialogue. Now remember, we're talking about double quotes and not single quotes. We never use single quotes. Use quotes and a period terminator when performing simple quoting of statements. So let me give you an example. Don't be stupid, Leroy. Notice once again that comma between don't be stupid and who's being talked to. That's the way that you typically do it. Period. That's the first sentence. Another sentence, take the money. Period. Both of those are enclosed in double quotes. Somebody's saying it, but we haven't identified who. Potentially we know who because it's part of a lot of dialogue and there's only one person speaking. Note the comma between the first statement and the target of the statement. Once again, Leroy here. This is the way that you talk to somebody in dialogue. Use quotes and a comma to identify the source of a statement. As in this example, don't be stupid, Leroy. Once again, we've got that, but we end it with a comma instead of a period and have it say Laura said, period. This extends the dialogue through who said it. Don't be stupid, Leroy, Laura said, period. Take the money, and I would assume that since it's on the same line, it's Laura saying that as well. So that's the way I identify who is saying the quoted dialogue. Simple. 2 rules here. End it with a period, end it with a comma if you're saying who is saying it. Now, the only thing this says is that we're extending the dialogue through Laura said with a comma at the end of the first sentence. Now, let's expand on the basics even more. That was the extended basics. Now we're going to look at the extended basics. We're going to look at colons to precede a list. Remember? The basics of punctuation, colon, periods, question marks, commas, and quotes. So this is one classic way to use a colon. Another is to precede a list, as if I'm doing here, a separate list. I have a colon, and then I say, or I have a sentence, and I say colon, and then here's the first item, the second item of the list. And then I also use colons to join sentences together when I'm trying to save space for connecting words. Agile program management using Scrum and Trello. I can get rid of the words using by just putting a colon in there. Agile program management, Scrum and Trello. So I'm kind of connecting 2 sentences and getting rid of that extra word. It's a way to save space. Now we move on to ellipses, which actually an ellipsis is the ... So I guess if you had more than one of them, it would be ellipses. Interesting. Ellipsi? I don't know. But it's ... And you use ellipses to terminate a sentence that is incomplete. ... Or soon completed. So you can kind of put that pause in there. The pause is sometimes a pause and then the sentence is completed. And sometimes it's a pause that's never completed. John, I don't know what to say, Gloria gasped. I just don't. ... She didn't finish the sentence, and that's the way you use an ellipsis. Okay? Now, I did a quick Google search to see if I missed anything that would be egregious if I did not cover it during punctuation. And I came up with slashes, square brackets, and braces. And I'm not even going to cover them. Other than in coding, slashes is the only things that I use. And I use them to indicate options. So like spring / winters / summer / fall would indicate an option list. Another way is to indicate division or apportionment. So $100 per year or $100 / YR period, which is for year. That means $100 per year. They both mean the same thing. So that's another way that I use slashes. Use them very infrequently. And guess what, gang? That is everything. We have covered all punctuation. Now, are you ready to write? Let's go write and see what we can do with punctuation.